The story of the Ottoman Empire is one of extraordinary rise, enduring power, and eventual decline, spanning over 6 centuries and stretching across 3 continents. It is a story not only of war and conquest, but of intricate diplomacy, diverse cultures, groundbreaking architecture, and deep philosophical currents. Tonight, let your mind drift gently through time as we explore the full history of the Ottoman Empire, from its humble beginnings to its complex legacy in the modern world. Imagine a time around the late 13th century in the rugged and mountainous region of northwestern Anatolia. The once great Seljuk Sultanate was crumbling under pressure from Mongol invasions, fractured leadership, and regional infighting. The power vacuum in the region gave rise to several small Turkish principalities, known as beyliks. One such principality was led by a relatively unknown chieftain named Osman Bey, destined to lend his name to one of the most enduring empires in history. Osman was born around 1258, the son of Ertuğrul Gazi, a tribal leader of the Kayu branch of the Young Turks. Osman was known to be a charismatic and ambitious leader, possessing both martial skill and political acumen. He began consolidating territory by defeating nearby Byzantine and rival Turkish forces. His growing influence attracted warriors, scholars, and settlers, laying the foundation for a fledgling state. The year 1299 is often regarded as the birth year of the Ottoman Empire, when Osman declared independence from the Seljuk Sultanate. With that declaration, he established a new polity grounded in Islamic governance, tribal tradition, and strategic opportunism. But what made the Ottomans truly unique was not merely their military power. It was their remarkable ability to adapt, absorb, and govern diverse peoples and lands. Under Osman's son, Orhan, the Ottomans expanded across the Marmara region and captured the city of Bursa in 1326, which became their first capital. This marked a pivotal shift. The Ottomans were no longer just a frontier tribe. They were now a state with administrative infrastructure, tax collection, and a standing army. Bursa became a thriving cultural and economic center, attracting artisans, traders, and intellectuals. As decades passed, the Ottomans developed a system of government that blended Islamic law with pragmatic administration. They used a structure known as the devshirme system, through which Christian boys from the Balkans were taken, converted to Islam, and trained for civil service or military roles, most notably as Janissaries, the elite infantry corps known for their loyalty and discipline. The empire's expansion continued under successive rulers. Murad Fush established control over much of the Balkans, and his son Bayezid I pushed the boundaries even further. Bayezid's reign, however, met a dramatic turn in 1402 at the Battle of Ankara, where he was defeated and captured by the Central Asian conqueror Timur Tamerlane. This defeat plunged the Ottomans into a period of crisis known as the Interregnum, a civil war between Bayezid's sons for control of the empire. It wasn't until 1413 that Mehmed I emerged victorious and restored central authority. This period of fragmentation could have destroyed the fledgling empire, but instead it hardened the Ottomans and prepared them for their most iconic era. That era would begin with Mehmed II, also known as Mehmed the Conqueror. Born in 1432, Mehmed ascended the throne in 1451 with one ambition burning in his heart: to conquer Constantinople, the legendary city that had withstood countless sieges and served as the capital of the Byzantine Empire for over a millennium. In 1453, after a meticulously planned campaign and the use of massive cannons, the likes of which had never been seen before, Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople. The city fell, and the world changed. The Ottomans claimed Constantinople, renamed it Istanbul, and made it their new capital. This marked not only the end of the Byzantine Empire, but also the beginning of the Ottoman Empire as a true world power. Istanbul blossomed under Ottoman rule. It became a center of commerce, culture, and religion. Mehmed encouraged settlement by people of diverse backgrounds: Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Arabs, and invested in massive construction projects, including mosques, palaces, and public baths. The Hagia Sophia, a former cathedral, was converted into a mosque, symbolizing the transformation of the city. But Mehmed II's vision extended beyond conquest. He centralized government, codified laws, and supported scholars and poets. His court was a vibrant hub of philosophical and artistic exchange, drawing from both Islamic and Byzantine traditions. Following his death, his successors continued to build on this foundation. The 16th century witnessed the golden age of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent. Born in 1494, Suleiman ascended the throne in 1520 and ruled for 46 years, longer than any other Ottoman sultan. His reign represented the peak of Ottoman political, cultural, and military power. Suleiman expanded the empire's territory to its greatest extent, stretching from Hungary in the west to Persia in the east, the Arabian Peninsula in the south, and deep into North Africa. His navy dominated the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf, establishing the Ottomans as a formidable maritime power. At home, Suleiman transformed the legal and administrative systems. Known as the lawgiver in the Islamic world, he oversaw the compilation of a unified legal code that balanced Islamic Sharia with customary laws. His reforms streamlined taxation, regulated trade, and ensured justice across a vast and multi-ethnic empire. Culturally, Suleiman's court was unmatched. He patronized architecture, music, poetry, and science. The great architect Mimar Sinan, whose masterpieces like the Süleymaniye Mosque still stand in Istanbul today, flourished under his reign. The court also fostered the development of Ottoman miniature painting, calligraphy, and illuminated manuscripts. Yet even as the empire shone brightly, the seeds of future challenges were being sown. The complexities of succession, the growing power of regional governors, and the evolving nature of warfare and diplomacy all presented new difficulties. After Suleiman's death in 1566, the empire entered a long period of relative stagnation and gradual decline, although it remained a dominant force. The 17th and 18th centuries were marked by internal strife, economic troubles, and military defeats, particularly against rising European powers like Austria, Russia, and later Britain and France. Still, the Ottomans showed remarkable resilience. They reformed military structures, engaged in diplomacy, and modernized parts of their economy. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century aimed to centralize administration, expand civil rights, and adopt aspects of European governance. But it was not enough to reverse the empire's fortunes. Nationalist movements in the Balkans and Arab provinces, coupled with European imperialism, steadily chipped away at Ottoman territories. The empire, once a vast and unified power, began to fracture under pressure. By the early 20th century, the Ottomans were known as the sick man of Europe. World War I would prove to be the final blow. The empire sided with the Central Powers and suffered devastating defeats. In the aftermath of the war, Allied forces occupied Istanbul, and the empire was carved up by the Treaty of Sèvres. However, the story does not end there. From the ashes of the Ottoman Empire rose a new republic. In 1923, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk led the Turkish War of Independence, abolished the Sultanate, and established the Republic of Turkey. It marked the end of 6 centuries of imperial rule and the beginning of a new chapter in Turkish history. Yet the legacy of the Ottoman Empire continues to echo in modern culture, politics, architecture, and memory. From the minarets of Istanbul to the courtly traditions of the Balkans, from cuisine to philosophy, the Ottomans left an indelible mark on the world. As the 17th century progressed, the Ottoman Empire continued to face challenges from within and without. Though still vast and influential, the empire's centralized authority began to wane. Regional governors, known as beys and pashas, began exerting more autonomy, weakening the direct control of the Sultanate. Meanwhile, the Janissaries, once the elite force of the empire, became politicized and resistant to reform, often intervening in palace politics and even orchestrating coups. Economically, the empire faced disruptions as global trade routes shifted. The age of exploration had diverted the lucrative spice and silk trade from the overland routes controlled by the Ottomans to sea routes dominated by Portuguese and later Dutch and British merchants. This reorientation of commerce meant that the empire lost a significant source of revenue. Despite these difficulties, cultural life in the empire remained vibrant. Literature, music, and religious scholarship flourished. The Ottoman court was known for its ceremonial splendor, sophisticated etiquette, and its arts patronage. In the city of Istanbul, coffee houses began to sprout. Lively spaces of intellectual exchange where poets, philosophers, and ordinary citizens discussed politics, theology, and poetry over steaming cups of thick, black coffee. The 18th century brought both conflict and reform. Military defeats, such as the loss to Austria and Russia in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, forced the Ottomans to re-evaluate their military and administrative systems. Reformist sultans such as Selim III attempted to modernize the army along European lines, a movement known as the Nizam-i-Jadid, or New Order. Selim's reforms were inspired in part by the Enlightenment ideas that had begun to circulate through the courts of Europe, and by Ottoman envoys who had observed European progress firsthand. However, these reforms faced fierce resistance from entrenched interests, especially the Janissaries, who saw modernization as a threat to their privileges. In 1807, Selim III was deposed and later executed, illustrating the peril reformers faced in trying to change the status quo. It wasn't until Mahmud II, Selim's cousin and successor, that substantial reform gained traction. Mahmud, who reigned from 1808 to 1839, took bold steps to break the power of the Janissaries. In 1826, he orchestrated a dramatic and violent purge, known as the Auspicious Incident, in which the Janissary corps was disbanded by force. This cleared the path for Mahmud to implement wide-ranging reforms: new military academies, a postal system, census-taking, and the introduction of European-style dress codes and institutions. Mahmud's reforms laid the groundwork for an even more ambitious period of change, the Tanzimat, meaning reorganization. Spanning from 1839 to 1876, the Tanzimat reforms aimed to centralize and modernize the Ottoman state. The empire introduced new civil and criminal codes modeled on European laws, established modern ministries, created secular schools, and launched the first Ottoman telegraph and railway networks. One of the hallmark documents of the Tanzimat period was the Hat-i-Sharif of Gulhana in 1839, which promised equality before the law to all Ottoman subjects, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. This was a bold departure from the traditional millet system, which had organized society along religious lines. The goal was to foster a sense of Ottomanism, loyalty to the state rather than to religious or ethnic identities. But fostering unity in such a diverse empire proved enormously challenging. As nationalism swept across Europe in the 19th century, similar sentiments began to take root among the empire's many ethnic groups: Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Armenians, Arabs. All began to express nationalist aspirations, inspired by European ideas and frustrated by perceived inequalities. The 19th century also saw growing European encroachment. The empire's strategic location made it a focal point for British, French, and Russian interests. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, saw Britain and France ally with the Ottomans against Russia, not out of love for the empire, but to maintain the balance of power in Europe. Despite momentary victories, the Ottomans continued to lose territory. Egypt, though nominally Ottoman, had gained near-complete autonomy under Muhammad Ali. The Balkans, a region rich in culture and resources, began slipping away due to wars and uprisings, culminating in the Balkan Wars of the early 20th century. In response to these mounting pressures, a new generation of reformers emerged. Known as the Young Ottomans, they sought to marry Islamic values with constitutional governance. They succeeded in pressuring Sultan Abdul Hamid II to implement a constitution in 1876, introducing the empire's first parliamentary system. However, Abdul Hamid soon suspended the constitution and ruled as an autocrat, justifying his actions by pointing to the empire's instability. Abdul Hamid II, often referred to as the last effective sultan, tried to navigate the challenges of his era through pan-Islamism, a policy aimed at unifying Muslims under Ottoman leadership. But while he invested in infrastructure and education, his heavy-handed rule and reliance on secret police alienated many. In 1908, a group known as the Young Turks staged a coup and restored the constitution. The Young Turks, a diverse coalition of military officers, intellectuals, and bureaucrats, hoped to modernize the empire and forge a new sense of identity. Yet their rule was fraught with internal divisions and external threats. One of the darkest chapters in Ottoman history occurred during World War I. The empire, aligned with the Central Powers, entered the war in 1914. The conflict placed enormous strain on Ottoman resources and deepened existing ethnic tensions. In 1915, the Ottoman government carried out mass deportations and massacres of Armenians, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 1.5 million people. This tragic event, recognized by many as the Armenian genocide, remains a deeply painful and contested subject to this day. The war further hastened the empire's collapse. British and Arab forces captured key cities, and the empire's Arab provinces fell away. Istanbul itself was occupied by Allied troops after the war's end. In 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres sought to dismantle what remained of the empire, awarding vast territories to European powers and recognizing the independence of Armenia and Kurdistan. But this treaty was never fully implemented, as a new force emerged in Anatolia, led by a determined military commander named Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, rallied Turkish forces in a war of independence. By 1923, he had defeated occupying armies, abolished the Sultanate, and established the Republic of Turkey with Ankara as its capital. The Caliphate, a symbol of Islamic leadership once claimed by Ottoman sultans, was formally abolished in 1924. Thus ended the Ottoman Empire, an entity that had lasted over 600 years, shaped the lives of millions, and left behind a rich and complex legacy. Yet even in its absence, the empire's influence lingers. Istanbul, with its minarets, palaces, and mosaics, still evokes the grandeur of the Ottomans. Legal codes, culinary traditions, architectural styles, and cultural expressions across the Balkans, Middle East, and North Africa bear traces of Ottoman influence. Ottoman cuisine, with its blend of Central Asian, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean elements, lives on in dishes like baklava, kebabs, and dolma. Turkish coffee, thick and aromatic, continues to be a ritual in many homes. The arts of calligraphy, miniature painting, and music, cultivated under Ottoman patronage, still inspire artists today. The empire also left behind a rich philosophical and religious tradition. Sufi orders such as the Mevlevis, known for their whirling dervish ceremonies, were nurtured under Ottoman rule. Islamic scholars engaged in theological debates and jurisprudence that influenced generations. In historiography, the Ottomans challenged simple narratives. Were they a European empire, an Asian one, a caliphate, a colonial power? The answer is yes and no. They were all of these and more, a bridge between East and West, a crucible of cultures, a bureaucracy of paradoxes, and a symbol of endurance. Their story is not one of static decline, as once portrayed in Western histories, but one of dynamic adaptation, resilience, and transformation. The empire redefined itself repeatedly in the face of shifting political, military, and economic realities. And while it ultimately succumbed to the pressures of modernity and nationalism, it left behind a world forever altered by its presence. To truly understand the depth of the Ottoman Empire, we must go beyond the chronological events and explore the intricate systems, philosophies, and daily lives that defined its internal world. This next part of our journey takes us through the inner workings of Ottoman society, its administration, legal framework, cultural fabric, and religious pluralism. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire was a marvel of administrative complexity. Governed from the Sublime Porte in Istanbul, the empire managed diverse populations through a highly organized system of provinces, districts, and municipalities. Governors were appointed directly by the Sultan and charged with maintaining order, collecting taxes, and enforcing imperial law. But this wasn't a one-size-fits-all model. The Ottomans were deeply pragmatic. Instead of imposing a rigid cultural or religious conformity, they utilized the millet system, a decentralized method of governance that granted religious communities autonomy over their internal affairs. Each millet was led by its own religious authority: the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, the Armenian Catholicos, the chief rabbi, and others. These leaders were responsible for collecting taxes, managing schools, and adjudicating legal disputes within their communities. This structure fostered a remarkable degree of coexistence, at least by the standards of the time. Christians and Jews could worship freely, build schools, and participate in economic life, provided they remained loyal to the empire. They paid a special tax, the jizya, in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. However, this coexistence was hierarchical. Muslims enjoyed privileged legal status, and conversion to Islam was encouraged, though not typically forced. This created a layered society where one's religious identity influenced social mobility and access to power. The Ottoman legal system reflected this pluralism. There were multiple overlapping legal frameworks: Sharia law, derived from Islamic jurisprudence; Qanon, secular laws issued by the sultans; and community-specific regulations administered by each millet. This legal pluralism allowed the Ottomans to govern a vast and diverse empire while maintaining relative order and stability. The Sultan was the apex of this administrative pyramid, both a temporal ruler and the caliph, or religious leader, of Sunni Islam. His power was immense, yet constrained by tradition, advisors, and court politics. The imperial harem, often romanticized in popular culture, was in reality a political institution. Women in the harem, especially the Valide Sultan, mother of the reigning sultan, wielded considerable influence over succession, diplomacy, and patronage. The Ottoman palace was more than a royal residence. It was a complex bureaucracy. Topkapi Palace, perched on the edge of the Golden Horn, housed the Divan, or Imperial Council, which included the Grand Vizier, Prime Minister, judges, finance officials, and military commanders. These advisors debated policies, implemented orders, and managed the state's vast affairs. The empire's communication network was also highly advanced for its time. Couriers on horseback relayed messages across thousands of miles, from North Africa to the Caucasus. These messages were often encoded, and intelligence gathering became a critical function of the state, foreshadowing the emergence of modern diplomatic corps. Education was another pillar of Ottoman society. The empire maintained a network of religious schools known as madrasas, which taught theology, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. These schools produced a class of scholars and bureaucrats who staffed the empire's mosques, courts, and ministries. Alongside the madrasas were the guilds, associations of artisans, merchants, and tradespeople. These guilds regulated prices, quality, and apprenticeship, but also served as social safety nets, organizing festivals, supporting widows, and even negotiating with local authorities. One cannot explore the Ottoman world without delving into its art and architecture. Ottoman aesthetics combined elements of Central Asian, Persian, Arab, and Byzantine traditions to create a style both elegant and monumental. Mosques were the empire's most iconic architectural expressions, especially the grand imperial mosques of Istanbul. Mimar Sinan, the chief architect under Suleiman the Magnificent, left an indelible mark with structures like the Süleymaniye Mosque and the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne. His work exemplified symmetry, light, and scale, spaces designed to inspire spiritual awe and communal unity. Ottoman calligraphy, often inscribed on mosque walls, manuscripts, and public buildings, became a highly respected art form. Master calligraphers trained for years to perfect the flowing scripts used to transcribe the Quran and official documents. Each curve and flourish was a meditation on divine beauty. The empire also fostered a rich tradition of music. Classical Ottoman music, influenced by Persian and Arab modes, used instruments like the oud, ney, flute, and kanun, zither. Music permeated court life, religious ceremonies, and everyday celebrations. Poets too flourished under Ottoman patronage, many composing in Ottoman Turkish, a language rich in Persian and Arabic borrowings, spoken in court but often unintelligible to common folk. Language and identity in the empire were deeply layered. Ottoman Turkish was the elite administrative language, while Arabic was used in religious contexts and Persian in literature. Among the populace, hundreds of languages and dialects coexisted: Albanian, Greek, Armenian, Kurdish, Ladino, and many more. This linguistic diversity was both a strength and a challenge, reflecting the empire's vast scope and its ongoing negotiation of unity and difference. Religious life was central to Ottoman identity. Islam infused the rhythms of daily life, from the call to prayer to the fasting of Ramadan. Yet even within Islam, there was diversity. Sunni Islam was dominant, but Sufi mysticism played a major role in the spiritual life of many Ottomans. Orders such as the Mevlevis, Halvetis, and Naqshbandis offered paths to divine union through music, dance, and meditative practice. The Ottomans also had complex relations with the Shia world, especially Persia. While the Safavid Empire promoted Shia Islam as state religion, the Ottomans viewed themselves as defenders of Sunni orthodoxy. This theological divide contributed to numerous conflicts, most notably the Ottoman Safavid Wars, which reshaped the politics of the Middle East. Despite these rivalries, the empire remained a nexus of religious scholarship and pilgrimage. Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities in Islam, were under Ottoman protection from the 16th century until World War I. The sultans took pride in their role as custodians of the Hajj, investing heavily in roads, caravansaries, and policing to protect pilgrims. Women in the Ottoman Empire occupied diverse roles depending on their class, religion, and region. Elite women in the palace had political power and were often educated in the arts and letters. Common women worked in markets, farms, or homes. In the legal sphere, women had rights to property, inheritance, and divorce, often more than their European counterparts at the time. Court records show that women regularly brought lawsuits and owned businesses, suggesting a degree of agency often overlooked in broader narratives. As the empire moved into the modern era, it continued to navigate the tension between tradition and reform. Debates over identity, governance, and law intensified. Should the empire embrace secularism or preserve its Islamic character? Should it adopt Western political models or reaffirm its own imperial institutions? These questions culminated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when intellectuals, journalists, and activists filled Istanbul's cafes and publishing houses with spirited debate. Newspapers, once tightly controlled, began to flourish. Books, pamphlets, and journals circulated ideas about democracy, socialism, nationalism, and pan-Islamism. Among the most radical voices were women writers and feminists who challenged patriarchal norms. Magazines like Kadınlar Dünyası, Women's World, advocated for education, suffrage, and social reform. Their voices joined a broader chorus demanding a new future, yet that future would come not through gradual reform, but through upheaval. World War I shattered the empire's military and economic foundations. The post-war partition plans further inflamed nationalist sentiments. The Young Turk leaders, who had once promised modernization, presided over disaster and defeat. Still, from this collapse emerged the modern Middle East, a region forever shaped by Ottoman legacies. Borders, languages, and political systems introduced during the empire's long tenure continued to influence successor states. In places like Bosnia, Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, Ottoman law codes, land registries, and urban planning remained foundational. Meanwhile, Turkey, the direct heir to the empire's heartland, embarked on a radical transformation. Under Ataturk, the country adopted the Latin alphabet, abolished Islamic courts, granted women the right to vote, and pursued secular nationalism. The Ottoman past was initially downplayed or criticized, but in recent decades, it has been re-examined with renewed interest and complexity. Today, the Ottoman Empire evokes a range of emotions: nostalgia, pride, resentment, curiosity. It is remembered as a golden age of Islamic civilization, a multi-ethnic experiment in governance, a colonial overlord, a tolerant protector, a decadent relic. Its architecture inspires awe, its cuisine delights, and its politics continue to provoke debate. Ultimately, the story of the Ottomans is not just one of emperors and wars, but of people, millions of individuals living, loving, creating, and dreaming under the crescent and star. Their stories, layered across centuries, invite us to think not just about the past, but about our own place in history's grand narrative. As we move deeper into the fabric of the Ottoman Empire, we begin to see how everyday life, customs, and beliefs helped shape and sustain such a vast and multifaceted civilization. This is the story not just of rulers and conquests, but of the rhythms of ordinary people, the merchants in the bazaars, the students in madrasas, the farmers in Anatolia, the dervishes in the lodges, and the artisans in their shops. Daily life in the empire varied greatly, depending on location, social class, and religious background. In cosmopolitan centers like Istanbul, Aleppo, Cairo, and Sarajevo, the streets buzzed with activity. Narrow, winding alleys opened into bustling marketplaces filled with merchants selling textiles, spices, ceramics, and jewelry. The scent of roasted meats, cardamom, and rosewater wafted through the air. Each city had its own unique blend of cultures and languages. Arabs, Greeks, Jews, Armenians, Slavs, Turks, all interacting in a dance of commerce and community. The bazaar was more than just a place to buy goods. It was a social and cultural hub. The Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, one of the oldest and largest covered markets in the world, symbolized the economic vitality of the empire. With thousands of shops, artisans, and coffee houses, it functioned as a microcosm of Ottoman society. Haggling was an art, and deals were often sealed with a cup of thick Turkish coffee. Homes varied widely, from the humble adobe dwellings of rural villagers to the ornate wooden mansions of the elite. Ottoman architecture favored courtyards, domed rooms, and intricately painted tiles. In cities, homes were often built around internal gardens, offering privacy and tranquility amidst urban chaos. Interiors were adorned with cushions, carpets, and low tables, reflecting the cultural emphasis on hospitality and comfort. Hospitality was a cherished virtue. Guests, even strangers, were welcomed with open arms, a practice rooted in Islamic tradition and social custom. Meals were often shared communally, eaten with the right hand from large platters, and accompanied by bread, olives, lentil soup, and meat stews. For dessert, sweet baklava, or a glass of sherbet, a chilled fruit drink flavored with spices. Religion permeated the rhythm of each day. The call to prayer echoed through towns and cities 5 times a day, reminding the faithful to pause and reflect. Fridays were sacred for Muslims, often spent in communal prayer at the mosque, followed by family meals. Religious festivals like Ramadan and Eid brought communities together in celebration and charity. But Ottoman spirituality extended beyond the formal pillars of Islam. Sufi orders infused daily life with mysticism and poetry. In tekkes, Sufi lodges, followers gathered to chant, meditate, and perform the sema, a whirling dance symbolizing spiritual ascent. The most famous of these were the Mevlevis, whose dervishes, dressed in tall felt hats and white robes, spun in graceful hypnotic circles. Sufi poetry, especially that of Jalaluddin Rumi, found a wide audience in Ottoman lands. His verses spoke of divine love, longing, and unity, transcending sectarian boundaries and reaching hearts across faiths and cultures. Rumi's popularity remains undiminished even today. His works translated into dozens of languages and celebrated worldwide. Marriage and family life were central to Ottoman society. Marriages were often arranged, with families playing a significant role in selecting suitable partners. The wedding ceremony was a major event, filled with rituals, music, and elaborate feasts. Dowries were negotiated and contracts signed in the presence of witnesses. Though patriarchal in structure, women retained certain legal rights, particularly in matters of inheritance, divorce, and property ownership. In fact, Ottoman court records reveal that women frequently sued for and obtained divorces, challenged unfair treatment, and protected their assets through Islamic law. Women also formed charitable endowments known as vakıfs, funding schools, hospitals, fountains, and soup kitchens. Through these acts of piety and civic responsibility, women gained social influence and spiritual merit. Education was valued across social classes. Boys typically began their schooling in neighborhood mektebs, learning to read, write, and recite the Quran. Promising students advanced to madrasas, where they studied grammar, logic, rhetoric, jurisprudence, and theology. Scholars were held in high esteem and often traveled from one end of the empire to the other in search of knowledge. Libraries, mosques, and schools were often clustered together in kulliyes, large complexes built by sultans and patrons. These centers of learning were open to all Muslims and occasionally to non-Muslims as well. They served as focal points of intellectual life and spiritual guidance, preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. Medicine in the Ottoman world combined Islamic tradition, ancient Greek and Roman knowledge, and practical observation. Hospitals, or darushifas, were established in major cities, offering treatment for both physical and mental illnesses. These institutions often included music therapy, gardens, and running water, based on the belief that healing required harmony of body and spirit. Ottoman doctors and pharmacists developed complex treatments using herbs, minerals, and surgical techniques. Medical manuscripts were copied and translated, blending Arabic, Persian, and European sources. While not immune to superstition, Ottoman medicine was far more advanced and humane than is often assumed. Travelers and pilgrims moved freely across the empire. Caravans crisscrossed the deserts and mountains, connecting Cairo to Damascus, Baghdad to Mecca, and Istanbul to Belgrade. Along the way were caravanserais, roadside inns offering shelter, food, and security. These stops were essential for trade and pilgrimage, fostering a sense of interconnectedness across the empire. Indeed, one of the defining features of the Ottoman world was its network of roads, ports, and trade routes. Goods from India, China, and Africa passed through Ottoman lands en route to Europe, bringing spices, silks, and precious stones. In return, the Ottomans exported ceramics, textiles, glassware, and leather goods. This global commerce enriched the imperial treasury and fueled urban growth. Istanbul, straddling two continents, served as the linchpin of this trade. Its harbours teemed with ships, and its docks bustled with activity. The city's skyline, pierced by minarets and domes, was a symbol of imperial grandeur and religious devotion. It was home to the sultan, the bureaucracy, the ulama, religious scholars, and countless artisans, traders, and migrants. Despite its magnificence, Istanbul faced challenges like overcrowding, fires, and epidemics. Yet its resilience was legendary. After each setback, the city rebuilt, renewed, and reimagined itself. It remained a beacon of cultural synthesis, where East met West and past met future. Beyond the urban centres, life in the countryside followed slower, cyclical rhythms. Peasants cultivated wheat, barley, grapes, and olives. Seasonal festivals marked planting and harvest times. Villages were close-knit, with customs shaped by local traditions, folklore, and geography. In the mountains of Albania, the plains of Syria, the forests of Anatolia, and the deserts of Arabia, Ottoman rule was often mediated by tribal leaders, local judges, and religious authorities. This decentralized system allowed the empire to govern distant provinces while respecting local customs and loyalties. Of course, not all was peaceful. Banditry, rebellion, and oppression were part of the Ottoman experience. Peasant revolts, sectarian clashes, and tax protests occurred throughout history. The state often responded with harsh measures, executions, deportations, and collective punishment. But at other times, negotiation, pardon, and integration prevailed. The military remained a central institution. While the Janissaries had once symbolized elite discipline, their decline led to new recruitment strategies. Provincial forces, irregular militias, and modern conscripts played larger roles. Military reform became urgent in the face of European advances, prompting the creation of war academies and officer training programs. The navy, once dominant in the Mediterranean under commanders like Barbarossa and Turgut Reis, had waned by the 18th century, but efforts were made to revive it with new shipyards, imported technology, and foreign advisors. Naval expeditions continued in the Black Sea, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, protecting pilgrims, commerce, and imperial prestige. Meanwhile, diplomatic relations with Europe evolved. Ottoman ambassadors were dispatched to Paris, Vienna, and London. Treaties were signed, alliances forged, and envoys exchanged gifts and knowledge. While European powers once feared Ottoman expansion, by the 19th century, they increasingly saw the empire as a buffer state and an object of intrigue. The Eastern question, what to do with the declining Ottoman Empire, became a major theme in European geopolitics. Each power sought to gain advantage while preventing others from doing so. This led to a complex web of alliances, wars, and conferences, culminating in the empire's slow dismemberment. Yet despite its decline, the Ottoman Empire continued to project an image of dignity and grandeur. Ceremonies, festivals, and processions were carefully choreographed. The Sultan's appearances were rare but powerful, reinforcing the mystique of his authority. Religious observances, coronations, and military parades reminded the people of their shared heritage and destiny. Even as cracks appeared in the imperial edifice, poets still composed verses in praise of the Sultan. Artists painted delicate miniatures of court life. Musicians performed haunting melodies in the palace halls. The empire, though burdened by age and conflict, retained its soul. As we continue our journey through the Ottoman Empire, our focus now shifts to the dynamics of change in the final century of its existence, the 19th and early 20th centuries. This was a period marked by rapid modernization, deepening crises, and an increasingly urgent search for a national identity that could hold the sprawling empire together. At the heart of these efforts was the Tanzimat, or reorganization era, which we introduced earlier. Beginning in 1839 with the Gülhane Edict, this period saw a determined push by Ottoman statesmen to revamp the empire's administration, economy, and legal framework along European lines. Influenced by Enlightenment thought, the French Revolution, and the experiences of neighboring powers, the reformers sought to preserve the empire by transforming it. One of the earliest goals was to standardize and centralize tax collection, replacing the old system of tax farming that had enriched local elites at the expense of the state. New ministries were established, and civil servants were trained in modern schools. The Ottoman bureaucracy grew more professional, but also more top-heavy, requiring careful balancing between efficiency and corruption control. A hallmark of Tanzimat reforms was the attempt to create a common Ottoman citizenship that transcended religious and ethnic boundaries. This was a radical idea in a society historically organized by the millet system. The 1856 Hati Humayun promised equal rights for all Ottoman subjects, regardless of faith. It guaranteed access to public office, education, and legal recourse. These reforms were driven not only by idealism, but by international pressure, particularly from European powers who saw themselves as protectors of Christian minorities in the empire. But implementing equality proved far more difficult than proclaiming it. Many Muslims viewed the reforms as a betrayal of Islamic principles, while non-Muslim communities often regarded them as insufficient or disingenuous. The resulting tensions fueled resentment on both sides, undermining the very unity the reforms sought to create. Meanwhile, the empire's strategic position continued to attract foreign interest. Britain, France, and Russia vied for influence through diplomacy, investment, and military intervention. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, fought mainly on Ottoman territory, saw an unusual alliance between the Ottomans, British, and French against Russia. Though the Ottomans technically emerged victorious, the war exposed the empire's vulnerability and dependency on European support. In the aftermath of the war, European loans poured into Ottoman coffers to finance railroads, telegraphs, and infrastructure. But these loans came at a steep cost. The empire's debt spiraled, and by the 1870s, it had defaulted. In response, European creditors formed the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, which effectively placed much of the empire's economy under foreign control. This loss of sovereignty deeply troubled Ottoman reformers and fueled nationalist sentiments. One group that emerged during this period was the Young Ottomans. These intellectuals advocated constitutionalism, freedom of the press, and checks on the sultan's power. They believed that Islam and modernity were compatible and that the empire could be saved by adopting a constitutional monarchy. In 1876, Sultan Abdul Hamid II ascended the throne amid growing unrest. Initially seen as a reformer, he approved a constitution and convened the first Ottoman parliament. But within 2 years, citing instability and threats to national unity, he suspended the constitution and ruled as an autocrat for over 30 years. Abdul Hamid II's reign was complex. He centralized power, expanded the secret police, and controlled the press. Yet he also invested in education, built railroads like the famed Hejaz Railway to Medina, and supported Islamic causes across the Muslim world. He envisioned the empire as a pan-Islamic power, uniting Muslims under Ottoman leadership and countering European encroachment. Despite these efforts, the empire's problems multiplied. Nationalist movements grew stronger, particularly in the Balkans. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78 ended disastrously for the Ottomans, forcing them to cede large territories and recognize the independence of Romania Serbia, and Montenegro. Bulgaria gained autonomy. These losses sparked waves of Muslim refugees, known as muhajirs, who fled violence and settled in Anatolia, reshaping the demographic landscape. In 1908, a dramatic shift occurred. A group of military officers and intellectuals known as the Young Turks staged a coup, restoring the 1876 constitution and ushering in the second constitutional era. They were part of a broader movement called the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, which aimed to modernize the state and forge a cohesive national identity. Initially welcomed as liberators, the Young Turks soon revealed authoritarian tendencies. They suppressed dissent, curtailed press freedom, and favored Turkification policies that alienated non-Turkish groups. Their attempts to centralize control backfired, exacerbating ethnic tensions and sparking revolts. One of the most painful and controversial periods in Ottoman history unfolded during World War I. The empire, now firmly under CUP leadership, entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. They hoped that victory would restore lost territories and prestige. But the war brought devastation. On the Eastern Front, fighting against Russia was brutal and inconclusive. In 1915, amid fears of Armenian collaboration with Russian forces, the Ottoman government ordered mass deportations of Armenians from eastern Anatolia. What followed were massacres, starvation, and death marches through the Syrian desert. Over 1 million Armenians perished in what is now widely recognized as the Armenian Genocide. The event remains a deeply divisive issue, but the suffering it caused is undeniable and tragic. Elsewhere, the British fomented Arab revolts against Ottoman rule, promising independence in return for support. T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, became a symbol of these efforts. Ottoman forces were gradually pushed out of the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Peninsula. By 1918, the empire lay in ruins. Istanbul was occupied by Allied troops. The 1920 Treaty of Sèvres proposed dismembering the empire, allocating parts of Anatolia to Greece, Armenia, and others. But the treaty sparked fierce resistance. In Anatolia, Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, organized nationalist forces to fight the occupying armies. Through a series of military victories and political maneuvers, the nationalists rejected the Treaty of Sèvres and forced a new agreement, the Treaty of Lausanne, in 1923. This treaty recognized the sovereignty of the Republic of Turkey, officially ending the Ottoman Empire. The Caliphate was abolished in 1924. The Sultan had already fled into exile. Centuries of imperial rule came to an end, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a long, painful transition. Yet even in its final days, the Ottoman Empire left behind an enduring legacy. Its institutions, cultures, and memories shaped the identities of the new states that emerged in its wake. From Iraq to Syria, from the Balkans to North Africa, former Ottoman lands bore the imprint of imperial administration, architecture, and law. The Ottoman language, a blend of Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, faded with the rise of modern Turkish. But Ottoman archives, sprawling, detailed, and meticulously kept, offer invaluable insights into centuries of governance, correspondence, and social life. Historians continue to mine these sources to better understand how an empire could function across such vast distances and complexities. In popular culture, the Ottomans are remembered in myriad ways. In Turkey, there has been a revival of Ottoman pride, seen in television series, museums, and public discourse. In the Arab world, Ottoman rule is often recalled with ambivalence, both as a time of order and as a symbol of colonial subjugation. In Europe, the Turkish threat lives on in historical memory, while scholars and writers re-examine the empire's contributions to science, art, and diplomacy. Architecturally, the empire's influence remains visible in mosques, bridges, palaces, and fountains. The Blue Mosque in Istanbul, the Bridge of Mostar in Bosnia, the walls of Jerusalem, all bear witness to an empire that built not just to rule, but to inspire. The story of the Ottoman Empire is one of ambition, faith, resilience, and transformation. It is a tale filled with contradictions, a caliphate that embraced secular reform, a military power that valued poetry, a diverse state that sought unity, an ancient regime that tried to modernize. It reminds us that history is never simple, never linear, and that the echoes of empire can still be heard in the lives we lead today. As you drift deeper into sleep, let your mind settle on the quiet truths beneath the grand narrative, the gentle clatter of merchants setting up stalls at dawn, the flicker of candlelight on mosque tiles, the rustle of pages in a scholar's study, the rhythm of oars crossing the Bosporus, the prayers whispered in dozens of languages across the empire's great mosaic. As we move into a more reflective chapter of the Ottoman story, our attention turns from empire-wide events to more intimate dimensions of life, rituals, relationships, philosophy, and the rhythms of time itself. To fall asleep to the full history of the Ottoman Empire is also to fall into a world richly textured by traditions of thought, spiritual practices, and the quiet pursuits that shaped the soul of the empire. Let us begin with time, not as marked by clocks or conquests, but as it was lived and experienced by the people within the empire. For the average Ottoman, time was deeply embedded in the cycle of prayer. The 5 daily calls to prayer, echoing from minarets across towns and villages, mark the structure of the day. These calls were not merely religious observances, they were temporal anchors, woven into the consciousness of every city dweller and villager. The Ottoman calendar was a blend of solar and lunar systems. The Rumi calendar, based on the Julian system, governed official administration, while the Islamic lunar calendar shaped religious life. Festivals, fasts, and feasts punctuated the year with moments of joy, solemnity, and renewal. Ramadan, the month of fasting, was especially significant. Streets would come alive after sunset with shared meals, sweets, and evening prayers. The pre-dawn meal, known as suhoor, was often accompanied by drummers walking the streets, ensuring that everyone woke up in time to eat. The empire also had a keen awareness of seasons and celestial phenomena. Farmers watched the skies to determine planting and harvesting schedules. Astrologers and astronomers tracked lunar cycles and planetary movements, often advising the court on auspicious dates for weddings, battles, and building inaugurations. Ottoman timekeeping was not just practical, it was imbued with cosmic meaning. Philosophy in the Ottoman world blended classical Islamic thought with mysticism, ethics, and metaphysics. Scholars studied the works of Aristotle, Avicenna, and Al-Ghazali. Debates were held in madrasas over free will, the nature of the soul, and the limits of human reason. Logic, mantik, was taught alongside jurisprudence, fiqh, and students were trained to think critically and express themselves with precision. One fascinating dimension of Ottoman intellectual life was the role of adab, an Arabic word encompassing literature, etiquette, and moral philosophy. To possess adab was to be cultured, ethical, and eloquent. It was a prized trait among courtiers, poets, and teachers. Conversations were often layered with allusions to classical poetry, religious texts, and historical anecdotes. The art of speaking well was matched by the art of listening carefully. In the Sufi tradition, adab extended to spiritual etiquette. Disciples in a Sufi lodge were taught how to behave in the presence of their sheikh, how to sit, how to breathe, how to serve tea, and how to enter a state of remembrance, dhikr. These practices cultivated presence, humility, and love, qualities considered essential for spiritual growth. And what of the inner life? Ottoman spirituality was not limited to rituals or theology. It included a deep engagement with the heart, the qalb, as a vessel of divine light and knowledge. Poets described the heart as both a battlefield and a garden. It could be tormented by worldly attachments or open to ecstasy through love of the divine. One popular genre of Ottoman literature was the masnavi, long narrative poems written in rhyming couplets. These works often blended romance, morality, and Sufi allegory. A beloved tale might describe a lover searching for their beloved, only to realize that the true journey was toward union with God. These stories were recited aloud, shared in gatherings, and copied into illuminated manuscripts. Music, too, was a path to the sacred. In the Mevlevi order, the ney, reed flute, symbolized the soul's longing for its source. Its plaintive sound was said to mirror the cry of separation from the divine. Musical modes, known as makams, carried emotional and symbolic resonance. Some were associated with joy, others with sorrow, healing, or contemplation. Music was considered a form of therapy, a balm for the soul, and a means of aligning the heart with the cosmos. The Ottomans also had a rich tradition of storytelling. The meda, or public storyteller, would perform in coffee houses, markets, and palace courtyards. With gestures, voices, and props, the meda would bring to life epic tales, humorous anecdotes, and moral parables. His stories might blend real history with legend, teaching lessons while entertaining his audience. One famous genre was the shadow play, known as karagöz and hasivat. These two characters, one clever and mischievous, the other pompous and gullible, offered a comedic commentary on Ottoman society. Behind the humor was a subtle critique of bureaucracy, hypocrisy, and class. These plays were especially popular during Ramadan, performed at night for families and communities. Another overlooked realm of Ottoman culture was the relationship with nature. Gardens were not just places of leisure, they were symbols of paradise, carefully designed to reflect divine harmony. The layout of Ottoman gardens drew on Persian and Islamic influences. Symmetrical paths, flowing water, aromatic flowers, and secluded pavilions. These spaces offered refuge from the heat, noise, and pressures of urban life. In literature, the rose symbolized beauty and divine love, while the nightingale represented the longing soul. These metaphors were woven into poems, textiles, and architectural motifs. The natural world was seen not as separate from the sacred, but as a mirror of divine artistry. Medicine in the Ottoman Empire reflected this integrated worldview. Physicians were trained in anatomy, pharmacology, and herbalism, but also considered the emotional and spiritual states of their patients. Music, aroma, color, and prayer were used to restore balance and harmony. Mental health was not stigmatized as it often was in other cultures. Instead, institutions for the mentally ill were designed with gardens, fountains, and music to soothe the mind and heart. Charity played a central role in public health and welfare. Wealthy individuals, including women, established vakufs, endowments that funded hospitals, schools, soup kitchens, public baths, and water fountains. These foundations ensured that even the poor had access to essential services, and they reflected a deep sense of civic responsibility grounded in Islamic ethics. Public baths, or hammams, were vital social spaces. They offered cleanliness, relaxation, and community. Men and women bathed separately, often in elaborately tiled chambers filled with steam and light. Bathing was both a religious obligation and a pleasurable ritual. It was also a place where people socialized, discussed news, and celebrated weddings or births. Birth and death were treated with solemnity and ceremony. Newborns were welcomed with prayers and gifts. The call to prayer was recited in the baby's ear, marking their entry into the world. Death was met with ritual washing, shrouding, and funeral prayers. Cemeteries, often adorned with ornate headstones, served as reminders of mortality and eternity. Poets wrote of death not as an end, but as a return, a journey back to the beloved. Tombs of saints and scholars became places of pilgrimage and reflection. In Istanbul and across the empire, these shrines offered solace, inspiration, and a sense of connection to the past. Perhaps most profoundly, the Ottoman sense of time and history was shaped by continuity. Change was acknowledged, but so was tradition. The calligraphy of the past was preserved alongside new styles. The prayers of ancestors echoed in new mosques. The scent of jasmine and the sound of the call to prayer continued to mark the passage of time. In many ways, the Ottoman worldview was one of balance, between the earthly and the spiritual, the old and the new, the diverse and the unified. The empire's longevity was due not only to its armies or bureaucrats, but to its capacity to hold these tensions with grace. As you fall deeper into rest, think of an empire lit not just by conquest or gold, but by candles flickering in study halls, melodies drifting through gardens, and footsteps echoing through quiet courtyards at dawn. Think of the ink on old manuscripts, the laughter of children in narrow alleys, the warmth of shared bread, and the hush of prayer at twilight. The Ottoman Empire, for all its grandeur and complexity, was built on such moments, the lived reality of millions of people seeking meaning, dignity, and beauty in a changing world. To truly appreciate the vastness of the Ottoman Empire, we must also consider the many regions and cultures that existed under its broad canopy. Though often viewed as a monolithic Islamic state centered in Istanbul, the Ottoman world was in fact a patchwork of regions, each with its own customs, dialects, and dynamics. This mosaic of peoples and places contributed richly to the empire's resilience and to its challenges. Let's journey first to the Balkans, a region that the Ottomans ruled for centuries. In cities like Sarajevo, Skopje, and Sofia, Ottoman influence remains visible in the form of mosques, bridges, and markets. The Balkans were among the first regions conquered and among the last to be lost. They played a pivotal role in the military, economic, and administrative life of the empire. The Ottomans practiced a policy of relative autonomy here, often incorporating local leaders into the administration. Christian communities thrived under the millet system, maintaining their religious practices, languages, and schools. In many cases, Orthodox clergy wielded considerable power, acting as intermediaries between the people and the state. In return, the Ottoman state expected loyalty and taxes. When uprisings occurred, as they did periodically, they were often brutally suppressed. But this did not necessarily lead to permanent hostility. Many Balkan families sent sons into Ottoman service as soldiers or officials. The Janissary cause itself was initially composed largely of Balkan Christian boys, recruited through the Devshirme system. The Devshirme system, while controversial today, was at the time seen as a means of upward mobility. Boys taken from Christian families were converted to Islam, educated rigorously, and trained for roles in the military or bureaucracy. Many rose to high positions, becoming viziers, governors, or generals. Though it involved coercion, the system also produced some of the most loyal and capable servants of the state. Moving further south, we reach the Arab provinces, regions with deep Islamic heritage and distinct political traditions. Cities like Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo were major centers of learning, trade, and spiritual life long before Ottoman rule. When the Ottomans conquered these lands, they often retained existing structures, appointing local notables to key positions and respecting established religious institutions. Cairo, once the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, became a jewel in the Ottoman crown. Its madrasas, mosques, and marketplaces continued to flourish, and the city remained a hub of scholarly and cultural life. Ottoman governors in Cairo often wielded great power, balancing loyalty to the Sultan with local authority. The Hijaz, home to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, held symbolic importance. The Ottomans saw themselves as the custodians of Islam's sacred sites, and they invested heavily in their upkeep. Caravans carrying pilgrims and supplies were organized with military precision, and the annual Hajj was a major logistical and spiritual operation. In the eastern provinces, such as Kurdistan and Armenia, the terrain and tribal structures posed unique challenges. The Ottomans often relied on indirect rule, allowing local leaders significant autonomy in exchange for tribute and military support. These regions were ethnically and religiously diverse, with Muslims, Christians, and Yazidis living in complex interdependence. The Caucasus and eastern Anatolia saw repeated conflict with the Persian Safavids and later the Russians. These frontier zones were militarized and frequently unstable. Yet even here, cultural exchange and trade persisted. The empire's boundaries may have been contested, but its cultural influence extended far beyond them. To the west, in North Africa, the Ottomans established suzerainty over regions such as Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. These territories had their own histories of Islamic governance and maritime power. Ottoman control here was often loose, especially in the case of the Barbary coast, where local rulers operated semi-independently, engaging in piracy and diplomacy with European powers. The Mediterranean Sea was both a frontier and a highway. Ottoman fleets, at their height, dominated much of it. Naval battles against Venice, Spain, and later the Portuguese were not merely about control of trade. They were ideological conflicts, framed as struggles between Christianity and Islam. Yet in practice, the Mediterranean was a zone of coexistence, commerce, and cultural mixing. In the Aegean and Ionian Seas, island communities lived under varying degrees of Ottoman oversight. Greek Orthodox traditions persisted, and monastic communities like Mount Athos retained autonomy. Trade routes brought Italian, Greek, Arab, and Turkish merchants into constant contact, sharing languages, goods, and ideas. Moving east again, we consider Iraq and the Persian Gulf. The Ottomans controlled Baghdad from the 16th century onward, often contesting it with the Safavids. The city, once the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, regained importance as a provincial capital. Religious tensions between Sunni and Shia communities required careful governance, and Ottoman policies here were often reactive and pragmatic. Basra and the Gulf ports played crucial roles in maritime trade. The British, Dutch, and Portuguese all sought influence in the region, competing with Ottoman garrisons and local emirs. The empire's control here waxed and waned, but its presence shaped regional politics well into the 20th century. One of the more fascinating aspects of the Ottoman world was the mobility of its people. Pilgrims, scholars, merchants, and officials traveled across the empire with relative ease. Roads, caravanserais, and ships facilitated a flow of ideas and experiences. A merchant from Aleppo might conduct business in Venice. A scholar from Bosnia might study in Cairo. A Sufi mystic might travel from Konya to Baghdad on a spiritual journey. This mobility helped sustain a sense of imperial unity despite vast differences. The Ottoman identity, though never uniform, was reinforced through shared institutions, architecture, and language. Ottoman Turkish, used in administration and literature, provided a common medium for elite communication. The empire's aesthetic, its domes, arches, calligraphy, and textiles, was instantly recognizable from the Balkans to Yemen. Religious architecture served not just as places of worship, but as symbols of order and authority. The presence of a grand mosque in a provincial city signaled imperial legitimacy. These mosques were often part of larger complexes that included hospitals, schools, and soup kitchens. They embodied the Ottoman model of integrated, community-based governance. Provincial life varied enormously. In some regions, local customs prevailed, and Ottoman influence was felt only intermittently. In others, the empire's presence was more pronounced, with governors enforcing laws, collecting taxes, and maintaining security. In many areas, a delicate balance was struck between central authority and local autonomy. This balance was both a strength and a vulnerability. It allowed the empire to govern flexibly, but it also made coordination difficult during times of crisis. When revolts broke out or wars erupted, the state often relied on alliances with local power brokers whose loyalty could be fickle. Economically, the provinces contributed to the imperial treasury through taxes on land, trade, and goods. Agricultural production formed the backbone of the economy, with wheat, barley, cotton, olives, and grapes being staple crops. Regional specialization was encouraged: silk in Bursa, carpets in Anatolia, leather in the Balkans. Trade routes linked the provinces to global markets. Goods flowed in and out of Ottoman ports: coffee from Yemen, spices from India, sugar from Egypt, wool from Anatolia, and manufactured goods from Europe. The empire was not isolated. It was deeply enmeshed in global economic networks. However, these networks also brought competition. European merchants gained increasing privileges through capitulations, treaties that granted them tax exemptions and legal autonomy. These agreements, initially seen as minor concessions, eventually undermined local merchants and eroded economic sovereignty. Despite these pressures, provincial towns remained vibrant centers of life. Markets buzzed with activity. Religious festivals and public holidays brought people together. Schools taught children to recite poetry and scriptures. Artisans crafted goods using techniques passed down for generations. Life, though shaped by empire, was also shaped by place, by the rivers, mountains, dialects, and stories that made each region unique. As we close this part of our journey, let us reflect on the diversity within unity that defined the Ottoman experience. An empire of empires, it encompassed deserts and forests, coasts and highlands, Arabic and Slavic, Greek and Kurdish, Sunni and Shia, Christian and Jewish. Its cohesion was always in tension, always negotiated, and yet it endured. For over 6 centuries, the Ottomans managed to hold together a world of extraordinary variation, creating a civilization that was at once imperial and local, traditional and adaptive. As you drift into deeper rest, imagine walking through an Ottoman town. Hear the sound of a water fountain in a shaded courtyard. Smell the scent of fresh bread from a bakery. Watch a scholar writing by lamplight. Listen to the call to prayer echoing over tiled rooftops. This is not just the story of an empire. It is the story of lives lived in rhythm with the pulse of a vast and enduring world. As we journey into the final thematic chapters of the Ottoman Empire's story, we begin to explore its intellectual legacy, how knowledge, art, and innovation flourished under its reign, and how the empire became a bridge between ancient wisdom and the modern world. The Ottoman world was deeply rooted in the Islamic tradition of learning. The Prophet Muhammad's encouragement to seek knowledge, even unto China, inspired generations of scholars to engage with a wide array of disciplines. The Ottomans inherited and advanced this legacy, creating a sophisticated educational infrastructure and supporting intellectual pursuits that spanned the globe. Central to this intellectual tradition were the madrasas, religious schools attached to mosques and kulliyas. These institutions taught the Islamic sciences, Quranic exegesis, hadith, sayings of the Prophet, jurisprudence, and theology. But they also included subjects like astronomy, logic, rhetoric, medicine, and mathematics. In cities like Istanbul, Edirne, Bursa, and Cairo, madrasas formed intellectual hubs. Scholars debated legal theories, translated Greek and Persian texts, and wrote commentaries on earlier works. Education was based on mastery and mentorship. A student would study under a renowned teacher, earning ijazas, certificates, in various disciplines that authorized them to teach others. Libraries flourished, both in mosques and private homes. Manuscripts were lovingly copied by hand, often illuminated with gold and adorned with intricate designs. Scribes were highly trained, not only in calligraphy, but in the precise replication of texts. The Imperial Library in Topkapi Palace housed thousands of volumes, from treatises on algebra to Sufi poetry. One particularly fascinating area of Ottoman science was astronomy. Drawing on earlier Islamic, Persian, and Byzantine sources, Ottoman astronomers charted the heavens with remarkable precision. Observatories in Istanbul and other cities measured planetary motion, developed celestial maps, and refined calendars. The Ulugh Beg Observatory in Samarkand, though outside Ottoman control, inspired many in the empire. The Ottomans also maintained close ties with scientific developments in Europe. Translations of European works, especially in geography, navigation, and medicine, entered Ottoman libraries. Notable figures like Khatib Çelebi compiled encyclopedias and world maps that blended Islamic and European knowledge, seeking to harmonize ancient truths with new discoveries. One such work was the Cihanuma, or Mirror of the World, a geographical compendium that described continents, oceans, and cities with remarkable detail. Çelebi's approach was both empirical and literary, reflecting a worldview in which science, spirituality, and aesthetics were intertwined. Navigation became increasingly important as the empire expanded. Ottoman cartographers like Piri Reis created detailed maps of the Mediterranean, the Atlantic coast of Africa, and even the Americas. His world map, drawn in 1513, astonishes scholars today for its accuracy and detail, given the limited tools available at the time. Piri Reis was also a naval captain and historian. His Kitab al-Bahri, or Book of Navigation, offered not only maps, but descriptions of coastlines, harbours, currents, and sailing techniques. It was both a practical guide for mariners and a literary masterpiece, blending poetry with pragmatism. In medicine, Ottoman physicians advanced treatments in surgery, pharmacology, and hygiene. Medical texts incorporated the theories of Galen, Avicenna, and Hippocrates, but also included innovations based on observation and experimentation. Hospitals like the Suleymaniye Darushifa were equipped with wards, pharmacies, and lecture halls. Patients were treated with herbs, diets, massages, and even music therapy. One remarkable feature of Ottoman medicine was its integration of mental health. Institutions for the mentally ill were designed with beauty and tranquility in mind. Courtyards, fountains, and floral motifs were meant to soothe the spirit. Treatments included conversation, music, and occupational therapy, methods that modern psychologists are only now rediscovering. Another area where the Ottomans excelled was engineering and urban planning. The construction of aqueducts, bridges, roads, and fortifications required advanced technical knowledge and organizational skill. The empire's architects worked in concert with mathematicians, stonemasons, and calligraphers to create cities that were both functional and beautiful. The genius of Mimar Sinan stands out. As chief architect under Suleiman the Magnificent and his successors, Sinan designed over 300 structures, including mosques, palaces, schools, and bridges. His use of domes, light, and proportion influenced architecture from Morocco to India. His masterwork, the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, is considered one of the greatest achievements of Islamic architecture. Ottoman art was not limited to buildings. It flourished in ceramics, textiles, metalwork, and book arts. Iznik tiles, with their vivid blues, reds, and greens, adorned mosques and palaces. These tiles were not just decoration, they carried symbolic meaning, representing the harmony of the natural and spiritual worlds. Textiles were another major art form. Ottoman weavers produced sumptuous silks, velvets, and brocades, often embellished with floral patterns, geometric designs, and calligraphy. These fabrics were used for clothing, furnishings, and ceremonial gifts. The textile industry supported a vast network of dyers, spinners, embroiderers, and merchants. Calligraphy was considered the highest visual art. Writing was not only a means of communication, but a form of worship. The Arabic script, with its flowing curves and dramatic flourishes, was seen as an embodiment of divine beauty. Master calligraphers trained for years, often beginning as apprentices and progressing through strict disciplines. They copied Quranic verses, royal decrees, and poetic lines onto paper, walls, ceramics, and even weapons. Ottoman poetry deserves special mention. Drawing on Persian, Arabic, and Turkish traditions, poets composed ghazals, qasidas, and rubaiyat, lyrical forms rich in metaphor, imagery, and emotional depth. Poets such as Fuzuli, Baki, and Nedim explored themes of love, loss, mysticism, and power. Poetry was recited in salons, taught in schools, and exchanged among lovers and friends. The empire also supported prose literature, histories, travelogues, romances, and philosophical essays. Evliya Çelebi, the famed traveller, left behind a 10-volume account of his journeys through the Ottoman lands and beyond. His Seyahat Naimi is a treasure trove of observations on culture, cuisine, politics, and the quirks of human nature. Ottoman theatre was more limited than in some cultures due to religious reservations about acting, but shadow plays, puppet shows, and comedic sketches thrived. These performances often featured satire and social commentary, poking fun at bureaucrats, scholars, and social mores. They brought laughter and reflection to audiences across the empire. Coffeehouse culture played a pivotal role in Ottoman intellectual life. Though initially controversial, some scholars argued that coffee promoted idleness. Coffeehouses became vital centers of discussion, debate, and entertainment. Here, patrons read newspapers, listened to storytellers, played chess, and discussed politics. Ideas flowed alongside cups of strong aromatic coffee. The printing press arrived relatively late in the empire. largely due to religious opposition and fears of losing scribal traditions. Jewish and Christian communities adopted printing early, but it wasn't until the 18th century that Muslim publishers gained significant foothold. Once printing took hold, newspapers, pamphlets, and books began to circulate more widely, fueling a new era of public discourse. This intellectual awakening culminated in the 19th century with the emergence of reformist thinkers, novelists, and journalists. Figures like Namık Kemal, Shinasi, and Ziya Pasha sought to modernize Ottoman identity through literature and political thought. They introduced Western literary forms like the novel and the play, while continuing to engage with Islamic and Ottoman themes. These thinkers laid the groundwork for what would later become Turkish nationalism, but they also grappled with questions that still resonate today. How do we reconcile tradition and progress? How do we belong to both East and West? What is the role of religion in modern life? As we ponder these questions, let us appreciate the intellectual vibrancy of the Ottoman world. It was not just a place of sultans and soldiers, but of scholars and scribes, poets and printers, artists and astronomers. Its libraries held the wisdom of the ages. Its streets echoed with the footsteps of thinkers, dreamers, and visionaries. And so, as you rest, imagine yourself in a quiet corner of an Ottoman library. The smell of old paper fills the air. A candle flickers beside a leather-bound book. Outside, a muezzin's call drifts across the city. You open a manuscript and begin to read, not just with your eyes, but with your heart. This is the spirit of the Ottoman mind, curious, contemplative, and always reaching for the infinite. To understand the Ottoman Empire in its fullness, we must turn to its complex legal system, which served not only to administer justice, but to reflect and reinforce the empire's values, hierarchies, and identities. The Ottoman legal structure was neither uniform nor static. It evolved over centuries, balancing Islamic law, Sharia, imperial decrees, Kanun, and local customs, Urf. The core of the legal system was Sharia, derived from the Quran, the Hadith, and centuries of Islamic jurisprudence. Sharia governed personal matters such as marriage, divorce, inheritance, and religious obligations. It was administered by qadis, judges trained in religious law who presided over local courts. These courts operated in every town and city, offering a forum for dispute resolution, legal contracts, and public record-keeping. Qadis were central figures in Ottoman society. They were not only judges, but often mediators, moral guides, and community leaders. Their court records, known as sicils, form one of the richest historical sources available today. They provide insights into everyday life, business transactions, property disputes, guardianship of orphans, and even neighborhood gossip. The Qadi's task was to interpret the law with fairness, pragmatism, and compassion. Yet Islamic law was not the only source of authority. The Sultan, as the temporal ruler and caliph, had the power to issue qanuns, imperial edicts that supplemented and, at times, superseded religious law. Qanuns addressed areas where Sharia was silent or ambiguous, such as taxation, land tenure, criminal punishment, and administrative procedure. The most famous codification of Qanun came under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, known in the West as the Lawgiver. His legal reforms brought greater consistency and transparency to governance. Suleiman's laws were compiled by his Grand Vizier and legal scholars, ensuring that both Islamic and imperial principles were harmonized. These reforms were not only functional, they reflected a philosophy of justice as the foundation of legitimacy. Ottoman law also accommodated the diversity of its subjects. Non-Muslims, Christians and Jews were governed by their own religious laws in matters of family and worship. Each millet maintained its own courts, led by religious leaders who adjudicated according to ecclesiastical tradition. These communities also paid the jizya, a tax in exchange for protection and autonomy. This pluralism allowed the empire to rule over a multi-faith population with relative stability, yet it also reinforced communal boundaries and hierarchies. Muslims, as the dominant group, held privileged legal status, though many non-Muslims achieved wealth and influence within the system. Criminal law was more uniform. Offences such as theft, murder, and rebellion were tried in secular courts, where both Sharia and Qanun were applied. Punishments varied: fines, flogging, exile, and execution. The empire's penal philosophy combined deterrence with discretion. Judges considered intent, circumstances, and repentance before issuing sentences. In matters of land and taxation, the legal system was particularly intricate. The empire operated on a timar system, grants of land given to sipahis, cavalrymen, in exchange for military service. These lands were not privately owned, but held on behalf of the state. The sipahi collected taxes from peasants, maintained law and order, and served in the army when summoned. Over time, this system evolved. As the central state sought more direct control, it shifted toward tax farming, iltizam, where individuals bid for the right to collect taxes in a given area. While this increased revenue, it also led to abuse and corruption, as tax farmers prioritized profit over fairness. Legal reform was a constant theme in the empire's later centuries. In the 19th century, the Tanzimat era brought significant changes. New secular courts were established, modeled after European systems. Legal codes were written in Ottoman Turkish, drawing from French civil law. Law schools were founded to train judges in both Islamic and modern legal principles. These reforms were driven by both internal needs and external pressures. European powers demanded equal treatment for Christians. Ottoman officials sought to modernize governance and reduce the arbitrary power of local elites. Yet these changes also sparked controversy, as many saw them as undermining Islamic law and tradition. One of the most enduring legacies of Ottoman law was its record-keeping. Courts, tax offices, and government bureaus maintained meticulous archives. Documents were often written in elegant calligraphy, sealed with official stamps, and stored in registers. Today, these records form a treasure trove for historians, revealing not only laws, but the stories of people who lived under them. Turning now to the military, we find another pillar of Ottoman power. The empire's military system was renowned for its innovation, discipline, and adaptability. It evolved from a tribal cavalry force into one of the most formidable fighting machines of its time. At the heart of this system was the Janissary Corps, an elite infantry originally composed of Devshirme recruits. These soldiers were trained from childhood in the arts of war, loyalty to the sultan, and the discipline of military life. They were forbidden to marry or engage in trade, focusing solely on service. Their distinctive uniforms, music, and organization made them symbols of imperial strength. Janissaries were known for their use of firearms, a significant advantage in early modern warfare. The Ottomans were among the first Islamic powers to adopt gunpowder weapons systematically. Their use of cannons at the siege of Constantinople in 1453 stunned European observers and marked the dawn of a new military age. But the Janissaries were not the only force. The empire maintained a complex system of auxiliary troops, provincial militias, tribal levies, naval marines, and fortress garrisons. The Sipahi cavalry remained vital for mobile warfare and reconnaissance. Engineers, sappers, and logisticians supported large-scale campaigns with road building, bridge construction, and supply chains. Naval power was also crucial. The Ottoman Navy controlled key ports in the Aegean, Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Black Sea. Admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa and Turgut Reis led daring expeditions, clashing with European navies and securing vital trade routes. Naval architecture flourished, with shipyards producing advanced galleys and warships. Military campaigns were grand spectacles. Armies marched with banners, drums, and camel caravans. Camp life followed strict routines: prayer, training, food distribution, and rest. The army carried its own judges, imams, and doctors. Warfare was both a test of valor and a display of imperial might. The Ottomans also invested in fortresses, castles, and city walls. Defensive architecture was essential in an empire with long borders and diverse enemies. Fortifications in cities like Belgrade, Erzurum, and Baghdad were regularly upgraded, integrating European designs and artillery platforms. However, as Europe advanced militarily in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Ottoman system began to lag. Discipline in the Janissary corps declined. Command structures became politicized. Attempts at reform were met with resistance. Sultans like Selim III and Mahmud II tried to modernize the army, introducing Western uniforms, drills, and weapons. These reforms culminated in the abolition of the Janissaries in 1826, a dramatic event known as the Auspicious Incident. After a violent confrontation, thousands of Janissaries were killed or exiled, and their corps disbanded. A new army, modelled on European lines, was created, the Nizam-e-Jadid. This transformation was not just military. It signaled a shift in state ideology. The empire was no longer looking backward to its golden age, but forward to modernization and centralization. Military academies, foreign advisors, and new strategies reshaped the armed forces, preparing them for the wars of the modern era. Despite these efforts, the 19th century brought repeated military defeats. The loss of territory, prestige, and manpower took a toll. Yet the military remained a powerful institution, playing a key role in politics and reform. Many of the Young Turks, who seized power in the early 20th century, were army officers inspired by nationalism and military discipline. The final years of the Ottoman army were marked by both tragedy and tenacity. In the Balkan Wars, World War I, and the Turkish War of Independence, Ottoman soldiers fought bravely under increasingly desperate conditions. The empire may have fallen, but the martial traditions it forged endured in the armies of its successor states. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the silence of an Ottoman courtroom at dawn. A judge dips his pen in ink. A petitioner waits outside, holding a scroll. In the distance, the beat of a military drum echoes through the hills. The laws of men and the disciplines of war, tools of order in a vast and uncertain world. This too was the Ottoman Empire, a realm of justice and judgment, of swords and scrolls, forever balancing the weight of power with the search for legitimacy. As we enter deeper into the fabric of the Ottoman Empire, one cannot overlook the profound influence of religion, not just as a set of beliefs, but as a living, organizing principle that shaped governance, education, art, and daily life. Islam, in its Ottoman form, was deeply institutionalized and pluralistic, infused with ritual and tradition, and carried out through a constellation of roles and responsibilities across society. At the very top of this spiritual structure stood the Sultan, who held not only political authority, but also the title of Caliph, leader of the Sunni Muslim world. While earlier Ottoman rulers avoided declaring the caliphate explicitly, by the 16th century, particularly after the conquest of the Mamluks and the holy cities, the sultans adopted this role more formally. This move elevated their religious legitimacy and placed them at the heart of the global Muslim community. The position of caliph implied custodianship over Islamic holy sites, the defense of the faith, and the right to interpret and uphold Islamic law. This role resonated across a vast ummah, connecting believers from North Africa to India, from the Balkans to Central Asia. It also gave the Ottomans a diplomatic tool to interact with Muslim populations under European colonial rule, such as those in British India or Russian Central Asia. Beneath the sultans stood the ulama, the class of religious scholars who interpreted Islamic law, taught in madrasas, delivered sermons, and provided spiritual and legal guidance. The most prominent among them was the Sheikh al-Islam, a powerful figure who advised the Sultan and issued fatwas, legal opinions. This office, though subordinate to the throne, wielded immense moral authority. The ulama formed a distinct social class, trained in religious sciences and supported by waqf, charitable endowments. Their schools were found throughout the empire, from provincial towns to major urban centers. These institutions ensured the transmission of Islamic knowledge, values, and etiquette to successive generations. Friday prayers, conducted in grand mosques, were both religious rituals and public declarations of loyalty. The sermon, or khutbah, included the name of the reigning sultan, a symbolic act that reaffirmed the unity of spiritual and political leadership. Attendance was encouraged, and the mosque served as a venue for communal gathering, announcements, and social support. Beyond the legalistic and institutional realms, Islam in the Ottoman Empire was deeply experiential and emotional, shaped by the currents of Sufism. Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, emphasized direct connection with God through love, remembrance, and personal transformation. It played a central role in Ottoman religious life, offering a more intimate, poetic, and inclusive path to the divine. Numerous Sufi orders flourished across the empire. The Mevlevis, known for their whirling dervishes, embraced music, dance, and poetry as means of spiritual ecstasy. Their founder, Jalaluddin Rumi, though a Persian poet from an earlier age, became a spiritual beacon in Ottoman lands. His verses on love, longing, and divine unity were recited in homes and lodges, carved into calligraphy, and set to music. Other orders, such as the Bektashis, Qadiris, Naqshbandis, and Rifais, offered different approaches, some more orthodox, others more syncretic. The Bektashis, in particular, were influential among the Janissaries and known for their egalitarian ethos and tolerance of diverse practices. Their lodges, or teks, served as spaces of hospitality, teaching, and worship. These Sufi centers often functioned as sanctuaries for the poor, travelers, and seekers. They hosted communal meals, music sessions, spiritual lessons, and ceremonies of remembrance, dhikr. They were also sites of healing, offering solace to the grieving, guidance to the lost, and companionship to the lonely. Sufi saints were revered across the empire. Their tombs, known as turbes, became pilgrimage sites. People came seeking blessings, healing, or simply a moment of quiet reflection. These shrines often attracted endowments and grew into spiritual and social complexes, combining worship with education and charity. Women participated actively in Ottoman religious life, though often in more private or domestic contexts. They attended mosques, supported endowments, visited shrines, and practiced personal piety. Elite women established charitable foundations that supported schools, fountains, and hospitals. Many were patrons of religious architecture, commissioning mosques and tombs that still grace Ottoman skylines. One must also note the rich tapestry of non-Muslim faiths within the empire. Christians and Jews, though considered dhimmis, protected peoples, enjoyed a degree of autonomy unprecedented in many other empires of the time. They practiced their faith openly, maintained their own legal systems, and governed their communities under their spiritual leaders. The Patriarch of Constantinople led the Orthodox Christians. The Armenian Apostolic Church had its own hierarchy. Jewish communities, both Sephardic and Ashkenazi, flourished in Ottoman cities. They built synagogues, established schools, and contributed to trade, medicine, and science. The Ottomans were famously tolerant toward Jews, fleeing the Spanish Inquisition, welcoming them to Istanbul, Salonika, and Izmir. Religious minorities paid the jizya tax and were subject to certain restrictions, but they were largely spared the violent persecutions that plagued Europe during the same period. Intercommunal relations were not always harmonious, but they were often characterized by coexistence and mutual accommodation. Religious festivals brought life to Ottoman streets. Ramadan saw night markets, lanterns, and communal prayers. Eid celebrations involved feasting, gift-giving, and public performances. Mawlid festivals celebrated the Prophet's birth with poetry, sermons, and sweets. Non-Muslim communities had their own vibrant traditions. Easter processions, Purim plays, and Christmas celebrations colored urban life. Religion also shaped the arts. Quranic verses adorned buildings, textiles, and ceramics. Religious music included the haunting recitations of the Quran, the hymns of dervishes, and the solemn melodies of court composers. Drama, though limited by religious sensitivities, found expression in shadow puppetry, storytelling, and satirical poetry. Even in science, religion was never far. Astronomers calculated prayer times and Qibla directions. Physicians considered the body a trust from God to be cared for with humility and skill. Legal scholars debated bioethical issues in light of scripture and reason. Faith informed curiosity. It was not a constraint, but a lens through which the world was seen. The Ottoman Empire's religious culture was not static. It responded to political change, social evolution, and intellectual inquiry. In times of crisis, religion provided comfort and cohesion. In times of reform, it offered both resistance and renewal. The tensions between conservatism and innovation, between faith and reason, played out in sermons, debates, and everyday decisions. Perhaps the most poignant expression of Ottoman religiosity is found in its tombstones. These intricately carved markers speak not just of death, but of life. A scholar, a midwife, a merchant, a mother. Some are adorned with turbans or flowers, some with poetry or Quranic verses. They remind us that the Ottoman world was one where the spiritual and the material were always entwined. And so, as you settle into deeper rest, picture an Ottoman mosque at dusk. The light is golden, a call to prayer rings through the air. Inside, a few worshippers stand in quiet devotion. A Sufi spins slowly in an empty courtyard. A lantern sways gently in the breeze. These are the sounds, sights and silences of a world shaped by the sacred. This is not just history. It is memory. A memory etched into stone and paper, music and voice, soul and city. A memory that lingers long after empires fall. With centuries behind it, the Ottoman Empire entered the 19th century, standing at a crossroads. No longer the unchallenged superpower of its earlier days, the empire now faced the mounting pressures of nationalism, colonialism, and modernity. This was a time of sweeping change, an age of reform, resistance, and reinvention that would define the empire's final 100 years. The 19th century began with a painful awareness. The Ottomans were falling behind Europe militarily, technologically, and economically. The once feared Ottoman army had suffered embarrassing defeats. European powers carved spheres of influence within Ottoman domains, and nationalist movements stirred in the Balkans and beyond. In response, the empire embarked on a bold and far-reaching effort known as the Tanzimat, or reorganization. Beginning in 1839 with the Gulhan Edict, the Tanzimat reforms sought to modernize and centralize the state. Inspired in part by European models, the reforms aimed to revamp the legal system, improve taxation, standardize education, and professionalize the military and bureaucracy. The Gulhani Edict promised equal protection under the law for all subjects, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. It outlawed arbitrary arrest, called for fair taxation, and emphasized civic responsibility. This was followed by the 1856 Reform Edict, which expanded these principles and marked a turning point in Ottoman political thought. A new administrative class began to emerge, one trained in secular schools, fluent in European languages, and versed in Western political ideas. These bureaucrats staffed new ministries, managed infrastructure projects, and wrote reports and legislation. The empire also established postal services, telegraph lines, railroads, and census-taking. These reforms were not without controversy. Traditionalists viewed them as an erosion of Islamic identity. Some ulama feared the secularization of law and education. Meanwhile, European powers continued to pressure the empire for greater concessions, especially concerning the rights of Christians and Jews. The reforms were also uneven in practice, resisted in some provinces, embraced in others. Still, the Tanzimat period brought profound changes. Istanbul began to resemble a modern capital, with boulevards, newspapers, schools, and theatres. Ottoman law students debated Rousseau and Montesquieu. Medical schools taught anatomy and hygiene alongside classical Islamic medicine. Coffee houses buzzed with talk of politics, science, and poetry. In 1876, the reform movement reached a dramatic peak with the promulgation of the Ottoman Constitution, marking the beginning of the first constitutional era. Sultan Abdulhamid II initially embraced the constitution, which created a bicameral parliament and promised civil liberties. For the first time, representatives from all corners of the empire gathered in Istanbul to debate policies and represent their communities. But this period was short-lived. In 1878, following a disastrous war with Russia and growing internal dissent, Abdulhamid suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, and established an autocratic regime. His rule, marked by intense surveillance, censorship, and centralization, lasted for 3 decades. Yet even as he repressed political opposition, Abdulhamid also continued modernization in other forms. He invested in education, expanded the railway network, and supported Islamic unity. He saw himself as the global leader of Muslims and sought to use the caliphate as a counterweight to European imperialism. The empire's position in the world was precarious. The Eastern question, what to do with the weakening Ottoman state, preoccupied European diplomacy throughout the century. Britain, France, Russia, and later Germany all jockeyed for influence. Wars were fought, treaties signed, and territories lost. The Balkans became a flashpoint. Nationalist uprisings in Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania were fueled by ethnic identity, historical memory, and foreign support. The Ottomans responded with varying degrees of repression and concession, but the tide was against them. By the end of the 19th century, much of the European portion of the empire had slipped away. In North Africa, Egypt became a British protectorate in 1882. Tunisia fell to the French. Libya was targeted by Italy. The Ottoman grip on its African territories weakened dramatically, despite strong cultural and religious ties that lingered. Still, reform and cultural vibrancy continued. The late 19th century saw a flourishing of Ottoman intellectual and artistic life. Newspapers, novels, plays, and political pamphlets circulated widely. The literary language evolved, blending Arabic, Persian, and Turkish influences with more modern expressions. The Young Ottomans, a group of reformist intellectuals, called for constitutionalism, democracy, and the revival of Islamic ethics. They were followed by the Young Turks, who would become even more radical in their vision. Educated in European schools or Ottoman institutions with Western curricula, these figures believed that only sweeping political change could save the empire from collapse. The Young Turks moment came in 1908, when a group of military officers in Salonika launched the Young Turk Revolution. They forced Sultan Abdulhamid to restore the constitution and reconvene the parliament, ushering in the second constitutional era. Political parties formed, elections were held, and censorship was relaxed. At first, this revolution was met with jubilation. For a brief period, it seemed that a modern, pluralistic, and constitutional Ottoman state might be possible. Jews, Christians, and Muslims celebrated in the streets together. Women pushed for education and legal reforms. Writers and journalists enjoyed newfound freedom. But idealism soon collided with reality. Ethnic tensions resurfaced. Radical nationalism, particularly among Turks and Arabs, began to replace Ottomanism. The belief in a shared imperial identity. Political factions splintered. The Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, the Young Turks' main party, became increasingly authoritarian. Internationally, the empire continued to lose ground. Italy invaded Libya in 1911. The Balkan Wars of 1912-1913 stripped the Ottomans of nearly all their remaining European territory. Refugees poured into Anatolia, traumatized and destitute. These losses dealt a devastating blow to the Ottoman psyche and economy. Meanwhile, calls for reform turned into cries for revolution. Socialists, feminists, pan-Islamists, and secular nationalists all clashed in the streets and newspapers. The Ottoman Parliament was alive with debate but paralyzed by division. The empire stood on a precipice, full of promise, yet riddled with peril. As you rest, imagine a candlelit salon in Istanbul, circa 1909. Intellectuals gather to discuss Voltaire, Rumi, and the future of their country. Tea steams gently in tulip-shaped glasses. The city outside is restless. Streetcars rattle by. A newspaper boy shouts the evening headlines. The empire is stirring, its old foundations trembling, its new dreams still unformed. This was the final turning. A century of reform and resistance had brought the empire to a new threshold. Beyond it lay a world war, a revolution, and the end of an age. The twilight of the Ottoman Empire unfolded with both grandeur and grief, as the early 20th century brought the final blows to a dynasty that had ruled for over 600 years. The empire, weakened by internal fractures and external pressures, entered its last chapter with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The Ottomans, aligned with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoped to reclaim lost prestige and territory. But this war would prove catastrophic. Despite early military successes, such as the stunning defense at Gallipoli, where Ottoman troops under Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, repelled Allied forces, the strain of total war took a heavy toll. On multiple fronts, the empire faced disaster. The Caucasus campaign against Russia faltered in harsh winter terrain. In the Arabian Peninsula, British-backed Arab rebels, led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca, launched a revolt, inspired in part by the promise of independence. Ottoman garrisons in Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Damascus eventually fell. One of the darkest chapters of the war was the Armenian genocide of 1915. In the chaos of war and nationalist paranoia, the Ottoman government orchestrated mass deportations and killings of Armenians, who were accused without evidence of collaborating with the Russians. Over 1 million Armenians perished. This act left an enduring scar on the empire's legacy and continues to be a point of international tension and remembrance. As the war dragged on, famine, disease, and inflation ravaged the population. Cities like Beirut and Aleppo were devastated by shortages. Millions died, not only on battlefields, but in homes, markets, and remote provinces. The empire was crumbling from within. In 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ending its role in the war. The terms were harsh. Allied forces occupied Istanbul, controlled strategic ports and railways, and planned to divide the empire among themselves. The once mighty Sultanate was now at the mercy of foreign powers. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 formalized these ambitions. It dismantled the empire, assigning control of Anatolia and the Levant to Britain, France, Greece, and Italy. Armenia was promised a state. The Kurds were offered autonomy. Istanbul and the Straits were internationalized. The Ottomans were left with a sliver of Anatolia and the throne, symbolic and powerless. But the empire did not disappear quietly. In Anatolia, a resistance movement emerged, led by Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli. Rejecting the Sultan's submission, Kemal and his allies organized a new national congress in Ankara. They declared the sovereignty of the Turkish nation and launched a war of independence against both occupying forces and the Ottoman royalists. Over the next 3 years, Kemal's forces fought the Greeks in the west, the Armenians in the east, and the French in the south. The Turkish national movement gained momentum, fueled by a vision of a secular, modern republic. In 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished. Sultan Mehmed VI, the last of his line, boarded a British warship and went into exile. The once grand Topkapi Palace was emptied. The Caliphate, stripped of power, lingered briefly, but it too was dissolved by the new Turkish Republic in 1924. Thus ended the Ottoman Empire. It had ruled from the banks of the Danube to the deserts of Arabia, from the gates of Vienna to the shores of Yemen. It had been the seat of caliphs, the home of poets, the domain of warriors, and the keeper of sacred sites. It had overseen golden ages and dark episodes, reforms and rebellions, unity and fracture. The legacy of the Ottomans did not vanish with the Sultan's crown. It endured in architecture, cuisine, music, and memory. The mosques of Istanbul still echo with prayers. The laws and institutions of the Republic bore Ottoman foundations. Across former Ottoman lands, from Sarajevo to Jerusalem, people still speak of the time of the Turks, sometimes with nostalgia, sometimes with pain. The end of the empire gave rise to new nations and identities. Turkey emerged as a secular republic, reoriented toward the West. Arab lands became mandates and later states, grappling with their colonial past and Ottoman inheritance. The Balkans fragmented into modern nations, each weaving the Ottoman years into its own historical fabric. In historical scholarship, the empire was long overshadowed by European narratives. But in recent decades, interest in the Ottoman world has grown. Historians have uncovered its complexities, its administrative genius, cultural richness, and moral ambiguities. It was not simply an old empire doomed to collapse. It was a dynamic, adaptive, and deeply human civilization. To study the Ottomans is to study the art of governance in diversity, the struggle to balance tradition and change, the poetry of everyday life in a vast world. It is to encounter minarets and marketplaces, decrees and devotions, triumphs and tragedies. As you fall asleep now, picture the Bosphorus at twilight. The sky is painted in soft hues of pink and gold. A call to prayer floats across the water. A boat glides silently between continents. Somewhere in the old city, a lamp is lit in a library, and a dusty book is opened. Its pages whisper stories of emperors and architects, rebels and mystics, shopkeepers and scholars. Good night, and may your rest be as deep and enduring as the history we have wandered through.